lastly, history has shown that society can be one of slaves and serfs, with the privileged few house slaves and even fewer ruling and enslaving others, taking all of the treasure and leaving little for everyone else. Or it can be one where the majority live a life of dignity, a life they have time to enjoy, free from worry and suffering, with a small majority of slightly better off people, but with a limit to their influence. At the moment, the choice in America and most of the rest of the world is the prior, an existence that, by any definition, should be deemed immoral. Social democracy isn't totalitarian communism. In the last 80 years, no socially democratic country today has become communist, totalitarian, authoritarian, or a dictatorship. In fact, most countries were modeling themselves after America and its New Deal policies. Yes, America, in what most would say was its glory days, had a 90% tax on upper incomes, had no profit health insurance like Blue Cross and Blue Shield, which cost $6 a year and provided up to 21 days in the hospital. America had free universities and high union membership, all the things that most of the countries we call socially democratic today, where you will find the most socialized countries, are the happiest in the world. They work less, they're more productive, they have less crime and larger middle class. Social democracy does not steal from the rich to give to the poor. It helps to prevent the rich from creating poor out of the middle class and acts to prevent the rich from preying on the other classes through fraud, crime, and exploitation. History is about progress. If you're religious, it should mean self-betterment. We should be becoming better people, more civilized, with less suffering. If you believe in evolution, you should believe in progress as a part of evolution. We evolve to higher states. We improve. We should be becoming more intelligent, more sophisticated. If you look at history, it is a history of countries that rose and then fell due to unbridled ambition without any regulation to prevent excess. From Babylon to the Pharaohs, Greece, Rome, China, Ottomans, Vikings, Mongols, England, Spain, France, the Dutch, Portugal, Japan, and Germany, and now America, unbridled acquisition of wealth destroyed many, if not most, internally. The kind of governance that is antithetical to social democracy is based on the freedom to do what you want, even if it's destructive. Generally, even in laissez-faire freedom, we don't have the freedom to harm others directly, but we can systemically. Without a system of laws, without a planning system for civilized society, there's nothing stopping society's decline. Without regulation, there's nothing stopping the decimation of our environment. There's nothing stopping the crashing of our economies. This type of freedom isn't about merely the freedom to destroy yourself. It destroys others as well, something no one should be free to do. Opponents of social democracy find it a hindrance to do so in the way criminals find police and laws a hindrance. Social democracy saves people money. Yes, it generally means more taxes, but if you pay $5,000 a year extra in taxes but pay $10,000 less in health insurance, daycare, and student loans, you're actually making more money. With more money in people's hands as opposed to a small group of businessmen, local businesses thrive, communities thrive, and standard of living increases. More taxes go to better infrastructure, better schools, better parks, libraries, cleaner streets, less homeless, less crime, and more safety. If you really want to run your country well and like a business, you have to do everything that businesses do, and that includes investing in it. Social democracy isn't taking away freedom, it's about taking care of and investing in society. Those who want freedom without concern for effects on society do so with the rationale that things crash and break, but eventually they correct themselves. Technically, they're correct. Everything corrects itself, even extinction. We are here because the dinosaurs went extinct, and something other will arise from our extinction as well, and life will start all over again. But is that what we want? Or do we want to move forward on what we've built? Without anyone preventing our excesses and destructive behavior, our own self-interest, without any scrutiny and restrictions on destructive behavior, like the dinosaurs and empires of the past, our history will be one of catastrophe and annihilation. Democracy is a social construct. The word social comes from the word society. Democracies, countries, states, counties, cities are all forms of society. It is a society that stands for freedom against the rule and slavery of a ruler or a ruling class. The more social it is, the more democratic it is. It can use its resources to help the majority and not a minority of rich that already have their comfort and therefore do not need any help. It can use its wealth to offer low-interest loans for housing and schooling, or simply pay for higher education like it does in other countries and did in America's past. You can create local internet that is free from hindrances by large corporations and operate it in a profit-free environment that offers low costs. You can do the same with health insurance like it does with Medicare. It must be maintained, though. Its people must be vigilant towards corruption within, but at least it allows for oversight, unlike unaccountable dictatorial businesses. Social democracy is also the ability to manage our societies. In a democracy, the majority should have a say in how they live. That is true freedom, true liberty. Prior to the modern age, we had no say in how our society should be. It was dictated to us by a small authority of nobles. In the modern industrial age, we've had either managed societies and economies or market-based economies and societies. The market-based societies left the market grow wild in hopes that monetary increases will benefit everyone, but the motivation of the market is to make money, and to make money you must get as much as you can from someone else. It has no consideration for the effects on society and leads to short-term profits that ignore any negative consequences. In a managed society, we can look to see if the economy is a benefit or a detriment and create policies to correct imbalances. The market-based society has no such mechanism. Market-based societies only look at one side of the ledger, creating wealth but not saving costs to the consumer. Managed societies in the post-World War II era pooled their money and made low-cost houses, gave low-cost loans. We pooled our money and created low-cost university education. This actually creates wealth by saving people money. The money they weren't spending on loans to banks, they could spend on their families. They had money for the dentist, vacation, gardening, recreation. All this money went back into the economy, and this is why the managed societies are actually better market economies than the ones where the market decides. Almost everything the market-based economy offers is a decrease in living standards for the majority and an exorbitant increase for a small few. Market-based, unmanaged economies actually destroy the economy and destroy the companies within them. It's not just America either. If you look at the countries that have adopted market-based societies and solutions as opposed to managed economies, you see the same things happening. The market-based societies are all suffering from increased numbers of people who work full-time and can barely afford their basic needs. This is something unprecedented, where a large group of people are working full-time yet living in poverty. This is something we're seeing in most, if not all, the countries that tried the market-based experiment, like America, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. There's always been poverty and homelessness. It became much worse in America, largely when funding for mentally ill was taken away.
But before 1980, we didn't have homelessness. So I know there was a time before where there was no homeless. We didn't see people with mental illness on the streets. And I also know, and what I find most painful, is that we know how to cure this problem. And it's just a matter of putting the political will and the resources in place to end it.
Many returning from war, suffering psychological damage, or just those mentally afflicted that couldn't take care of themselves found themselves on the streets. Today you see families of hardworking people working 60 or more hours a week, living in their cars or on their street. You see massive increases of those getting their food from food pantries and food sharing programs. These places all report that it's no longer just the mentally ill, but normal, hardworking people that are showing up regularly. This is a failed society.
Imagine the Great Depression. People lined up in soup kitchens, hobos in hobo camps, riding the rails. All these images are seared into our history. And look around today. The lineups at soup kitchens, so outrageous back in the 30s, now we see lineup at food banks. Food banks have now become established institutions in this country. We are still told that all those great gains that were made during the Great Depression and afterwards for social safety net, welfare, unemployment insurance, all of those things are still there, but they aren't. Why is it that people can't feel outraged when they see homeless in the streets today and lineups at food bank, yet they can still feel outraged when they look at an old film about the 30s and say, wasn't that awful? Well, look around, it's happening today.
There are nearly 4 million people in Britain still living in poverty, despite being in work. According to research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, that's a record figure.
More people are in work, but that means that we're having more people in those low-paid jobs, but also not able to get enough hours to actually get the money for the household, and particularly if you're balancing caring for children, for older people, for disabled people, it can be very hard to get that balance right.
But when it comes to in-work poverty, it's almost undermining that very British statement, an honest day's pay for an honest day's work.
Usually what happens is...
Cynthia Ganesh-Panchen runs a charity in Leicester. Its food bank was launched for people out of work. Now the employed on low wages are coming through the door.
The promise we've been given, I think, generation after generation, if you work hard, you will have a decent life. And I think that promise is which is broken, because no longer people who work hard are having access to that decent life which was promised to us.
Why is the gap between the rich and the poor growing faster in New Zealand than most developed countries in the world? And why is that bad for all of us? What's an economy for? In New Zealand I grew up, and we believed that by paying our taxes we were building a society where everybody got a fair go. Equality of opportunity was something that made us proud to be Kiwis, a land where a boy from a state house could grow up to be the Prime Minister. Today, getting a state house isn't that easy. We don't just have unemployed poor anymore. A new class of working poor has emerged, people who work all week but can't make ends meet. But the average price of food has gone up 217% since I had a young family 30 years ago.
Thought we were done. I mean, hadn't our parents and our grandparents fought long and hard to produce a new society, a more just society? Because after the Great Depression and the horrors of the Second World War, Canadians seem to have come together and said, never again. They wanted to build a society that was capitalist, yes, but with a human face and a helping hand. We introduced universal health care, unemployment insurance, pensions for old people, laws that made it possible for workers to form unions. We wanted to build a society that was good for everybody in the society, not just the barons of Bay Street, good for them too, but for the workers in Winnipeg also. But over the last 20 or 30 years, subtly at first, all that seems to have changed. And all that work that all those generations of Canadians had to do, slowly but surely, seems to have been undone. As a country, we often stand up at the UN to brag that we are great leaders in human rights, rights around poverty, food, housing, and employment. Unfortunately, the UN doesn't see it that way.
The UN has said very clearly to the Government of Canada repeatedly, no, you're not doing all right. You're one of the richest countries in the world. You've got a poverty problem. You've got a homelessness problem. You've got a hunger problem. What does Canada do in response? There's a whole list of recommendations. The UN says do A, B, C, D. What does Canada do? Nothing. Nothing.
I don't think ordinary Canadians understand just how powerful the business community and its lobby, its political organizations are in this country, and always have been. In the 80s, we had another example of this kind of incredibly close and almost domineering relationship when Tom DeKino, the leading advocate of the Canadian business lobby in the 80s, went to Mulroney and to the premiers with the support of all the major corporations of Canada and said, here's what we want. We want free trade. We want deregulation. We want privatization. Cutbacks in social spending. We need to lower taxes, fewer social programs. And that's what they've been doing ever since. If people were aware of it, it would be the first step to changing it, because it's just simply appalling when you actually realize that the business community, who are unelected, run this country.
The Canadian Council of Chief Executives has a direct line to the Prime Minister's office.
The Canadian Council of Chief Executives is an organization composed of the CEOs of Canada's top 150 corporations. Tom DeKino, the head of the council, in fact boasts often that no other organization in the world at the CEO level has taken such an active interest in lobbying, in politics, and influencing the public. Some have even compared the council to a parallel government or a second government in Canada, with Tom DeKino right at the top as de facto Prime Minister. If it wasn't for the agenda, the concrete political agendas put forth by these groups, the country would be a very different place. We would not have the level of inequality we have today.
And we believe that everyone has the right to be unequal.
But it wasn't always this hard. Back in the 50s, the average Kiwi family could afford to buy a house and have mum at home looking after the kids. Back then, the class structure looked like this. There was a large working class and hardly any unemployed people at all, a reasonably sized middle class and a smaller upper class. And the more money you earned, the more tax you paid. Today, I suspect our social structure looks a bit like this. A large group of unemployed poor and working poor, whose incomes are supplemented by billions of dollars, paid for by what was once the middle class, but is now the struggling class. while the profits from things like rents and consumer items go into the pockets of the wealthiest 10%. So how did all of that happen? It shows that the gap between the rich and the poor is growing faster in New Zealand than most developed countries. And the reason that's happening is because of an economic theory that was adopted by our politicians about 30 years ago. Muldoon belonged to the war generation, and he believed in a policy of social spending that built the New Zealand economy after World War II. Returning soldiers found work on government schemes like building hydroelectric power stations, improving our communications and our railways. The idea was that we should all own and share the nation's wealth. So the government kept strict controls on how we made and spent our money. But some things we couldn't control, like when Britain joined the common market and the Arabs turned off their oil, and our money was eaten away by inflation that shot up to 17%. So Muldoon lost, and Labour, led by the charismatic David Lange, swept to power in a landslide victory. But when Labour eventually got to see the nation's accounts, they discovered the country was severely in debt. However, Treasury had prepared a document for their new minister which recommended a radical change in how we ran our economy. And this is it. The Treasury paper that changed our country from a land of cooperation and common ownership into a nation of competitive individuals and privatised assets. In short, it says the government should take its hands off the economy and to dump a whole lot of regulations that were holding back the finance and the business sectors. What it didn't say is that these were the very same policies of self-interest that Republican President Ronald Reagan was promoting. Such policies, of course, ran counter to the collective solidarity that the Labour Party said it stood for. But Treasury argued that it would be disastrous for the country if Labour didn't open up the economy. So Roger Douglas took a step to the right and committed New Zealand to neoliberal economics. Personal and company tax was lowered, controls on foreign exchange abolished, tariff and export incentives dropped. And to pay our $16 billion of overseas debt, he held the biggest fire sale of state-owned assets in our history. It's all part of what Professor Guigan calls zombie economics, dead neoliberal ideas that still walk amongst us like zombies, haunting the corridors of power.
The initial propaganda was we will give more money to rich people so that they can invest and create more jobs and have the wealth trickle down and so on. None of these have happened. Yeah?
Trickle down worked?
No, clearly it hasn't worked. Trickle up has worked. There is an enormous income concentration up at the top.
A couple of years of our switch to neoliberal economics in 1984, it was clear a major shift in the New Zealand psyche had taken place. Suddenly greed was good and debt was good, and the we society built by generations of cooperation and saving had been replaced by the me society, characterised by self-interest and consumerism.
You see worthless and higher costs for housing, education, and a plethora of other living costs. In the managed societies, you see low-cost housing, low or no-cost education, and higher percentages in the middle class with less income disparity. These countries have more money to spend back into the economy as opposed to the market-based societies where the wealth goes to offshore banks and casino investing. Commonalities are striking, and they all have or have had market-based free market politicians, most who claim to be left but dishonestly govern right. They are right-wing politicians pretending to be left. More and more countries are moving in this direction as well. And the one thing that all these politicians and the rich that bought them have in common is that they are all traitors to democracy. They are all working for the minority and against the will of the majority. They are all criminal racketeers.